What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Venturing Abroad, a podcast by Daphne, where we speak with entrepreneurs, investors, and leaders in the tech ecosystem about working, scaling, and investing across borders. My name is Erica. I'm thrilled to be joined by our co-host, Chris Pinto, one of our investors here at Daphne for this conversation. Hey, Chris, how are you?
Hey, Erica. Hey, everyone. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Michael Jackson to the podcast. Michael is an American in Paris, an entrepreneur turned investor who has worked at several firms across Europe and is also a prominent voice in European tech. Michael, we're so happy to welcome you today. Thank you so much for being here.
It's good to be here. It's my pleasure. Good to be back in Paris, where I got caught in a strike on my way here. Wouldn't be Paris without a protest.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Before we dive into your experience being an investor here in Europe, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Michael? Where are you from? And what drew you to this world of tech and investment?
So a little bit about me. So grew up in the U.S., but my father's British. So I grew up traveling all over the world, lived in a bunch of different places. Kind of became, always had an entrepreneurial angle in sort of my mindset growing up, but it wasn't I was never intentionally set out to be an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I remember doing entrepreneurial things as a kid. Like we had, very cliche, growing up in the Midwest in the US, we had paper routes.
Yep.
And I realized that I could take more paper routes and just essentially feed them out kind of in a franchise model to guys I played on a baseball team with. And I wouldn't actually have to do the paper route. I could just take a chunk off the top. And so I ended up having 24 routes when I did absolutely none of them. I just was like the manager for the routes. So always kind of did entrepreneurial things, and then went to undergrad, and in undergrad just happened to be in a quad with some guys in the sciences, and those guys introduced me to other people in the sciences, and I was kind of always more the business guy in the room. So from there, doing spin-outs from the university, I just became the business guy in the spin-out. And from there, scaled companies, exited companies. So, had a nice 9-figure exit from our company that we spun out from undergrad with a bunch of guys from Princeton and MIT.
Wow.
And then from there, got into the VC side and have been investing ever since.
How long has that been?
God, too long. No, 25 years.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. And what brought you to Paris? You've been here for quite a while now.
Yeah. Too long. So again, like as I said, I had my dad's family's British. I had some family in France, and so it was originally I worked in high school, worked in university, started a company. So I was doing 100-hour plus weeks of being a founder.
Okay.
Then went to VC and was finishing up my 20s and was just like I never really took a long extended time to just kind of not be working or a student. So I essentially did it was intentionally to do kind of a really late kind of abroad experience. And so it was supposed to be a 3-month sabbatical. And so I had family in London, family in Paris. I was supposed to go back and forth between London and Paris. And then the firm was just like, hey, do you want to maybe work while you're there? They had no interest in Europe. They had zero interest. They were just like, oh, let's, just don't go on pure sabbatical. So it became 3 months, and then 3 months became 6 months. And to be honest, I ended up staying in Europe. My biggest reason was, I think it was my first or second week in Paris. I got sat next to someone from one of the French banks, and she was just like, hey, you work in VC in Silicon Valley. Do you know anybody that wants to buy our portfolio? I was like, what the hell are you talking about? And she's like, oh, no, because this was during the financial crisis. And in order to get the bailout from the French government was like, look, all the banks have to sell off their venture portfolios. And I think what a lot of people now, especially since most people in European venture capital are relatively new, is they forget that 20 years ago, the biggest LPs in European venture capital were the banks and the insurance companies.
Mm.
I mean, Natixis owned multiple VC firms. Even Partech here in Paris. I mean, it started out as Paribas Technology. It was part of BNP Paribas. The banks and the insurance companies dominated the LP landscape here. And so honestly, so she was just like, hey, would you be interested in buying up our portfolio? And I was like, probably not. I don't think anybody really gives a damn about it. But I made a phone call back to the guys that I was working for in the States, and we had a really good relationship with Landmark. And Landmark at the time was the largest player in secondaries in Europe, USVC. And I was like, look, guys, do you guys want to buy up a bunch of European assets on the secondary market? And they're like, dude, there's no exits in Europe. Like, we're not interested. I was like, yeah, but you can get it dirt cheap. And I was like, how cheap is cheap? And I was like, you can get it for less than 30 cents on the euro in terms of portfolio value. And they're like, oh, no, shit, that's interesting. So I spent like the rest of the financial crisis just like buying up European portfolios.
And that was the first wave of European portfolios.
Yeah. And so, because you think about it, even if you're like from that initial value, even if you mark down 50%, if you're buying it at 30 cents, you still make money. And so it actually was quite useful for multiple reasons in hindsight, because one is I made really good relationships with people in money in Europe. So the bankers, the insurance guys, whatever, because I was just taking something that they didn't want off their hands.
Interesting.
And the guys in the States were just like, cool, we made money. Because there was like a lot of crap in these portfolios, but there still was some good stuff as well. So, and if you're getting it that steep of a discount, you can make money. And then from there, went back into VC in London because they were like, oh, why don't you come back to the States? And I was like, actually, quality of life's pretty good in Europe. And so, yeah, I went to investment side in London but always still did at least 50% of my investments in the States. Because I do think there is a lot of truth to make your money in the US and spend it in Europe. That adage holds up pretty well.
It's a recurring quote we hear on this show with our American guests, so that checks out.
But it's just a really tried and true model. There's just far more financial upside in the US, but there's just nicer ways to spend it in Europe. So.
What were some of the culture shocks that you faced when you first started your sabbatical in Paris and then started integrating yourself more in the ecosystem?
God, there's so many. Like, so, I mean, there was, to be fair, in like 2008 or whatever that was, there wasn't really an ecosystem. Like, it was just a bunch of, like, you had some smaller copycat businesses, etc. I think one of the first things that I distinctly remember in my mind was I was at a fundraiser in Paris, and I was at a table with a gentleman who at the time was CEO of a CAC 40 company. Actually, he was the friend of a friend's like father. And so we're at the table, he had way too much champagne. And he's like, Michael, he's like, do you want to know how you get ahead in Europe? I was like, sure, yeah, of course. How do you get ahead in Europe? He's like, what you do is you work really hard as a student, you get into an elite university, you go to a big name company, you keep your head down for 20 to 25 years, and that's how you get ahead. I was like, dude, that's the most depressing thing I've ever fucking heard. He's like, well, yeah, but that's the European model. I was like, so, and you just saw a lot of that kind of conservative attitude. And I still do. Like, I mean, I got sent a CV of a gentleman who did HEC here. He's in his late 50s. He's run a large private equity firm on behalf of a French bank for the past, decade plus. And the first thing on his CV is where he went to school.
Yeah.
And culturally, that's to me just mind blowing. I mean, the guy has 30 years of work experience and he still leads with where he went to school. And that's just something that happens more, particularly in certain parts of Europe, like UK, France, and a few other places. But I mean, if you have 30 years of work experience, that should speak for itself.
Absolutely.
Not the fact of where you went to school. And that pops up a lot with, still to this day, like you'll get like, especially like French pitch decks, right? They'll have like all where the founders went to school.
Yeah. It's like, I have deep business experience. I went to HEC.
Yeah. Like that's, and also, especially when you're pitching people who don't know what these schools are. And it's gutting, right? Like I mean, it happens a lot here with people who went to Polytechnique. Most people have never fucking heard of Polytechnique outside of France. And it's gutting because for like the Frenchies that go there, it's like a really big deal. And you just do get that. So I'll see pitches where they'll just have that like really on the front page of the deck.
And I think that's something that the Nordics have done much better in Europe, which is to drive a global mindset from the early age for the students.
But I think it's also historic, right? I mean, you can go back like, I think it's some of that's cultural, right? So if you look at like the Hanseatic League and the fact that Northern Europe, particularly whether it was the Netherlands, the Nordics, Northern Germany, UK, whatever, they have these long histories of mercantilism where the France, the Italy's, and the Spain don't have quite the same. I can go back a long way. I can go back to like when I was an undergrad. I was dating a girl at Northwestern, I think it was, and like I picked her up. It was like a weekend thing, and she was just like, "Oh, like I have class. Do you mind going to this like lecture with me?" And this woman was talking about like how different immigrant groups in the US and certain regions impacted the cultures of those regions. So they were
Mm-hmm.
looking at like the upper Midwest, it's like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. If you were looking at the immigrants that came from um, the Nordic Scandinavian backgrounds versus the ones that came from like France and French Canadian and Belgian, it's a huge difference because the ones that came from the Nordics, they integrated faster. They tended to go more into business, whereas the ones that were coming from more from like the France, Quebecois, Belgian kind of backgrounds stayed very much more in agriculture and those types of backgrounds. And they also like intermarried less. And so it's just interesting to see. I think
Yeah.
some things that it's hard to change culture. And some of these things just kind of permeate. I remember I remember being in Chile and there was a guy who was just like, look, he's like the English built factories and the Spanish built churches. And that's one of the big differences here.
When tech becomes the big kind of like global stage for like wealth generation, in Europe, it always feels that we're catching up because we're trying to play the US game, or we're trying to copy, like with a delay, the Silicon Valley model. How do we kind of like create our own set of rules, or we don't? Like, how do you see that playing around?
I think, I think it's, I think there's an argument to say that you can't. Uh, Simply because if you kind of look at history, right? If you start to read like some of the letters and stuff that Nikola Tesla wrote in the late 19th century, like one of the reasons why he moved from Europe to the US is because he saw like the baton shifting in terms of innovation. And you can go back to like the 1920s, we had the Macmillan Committee in the UK, and one of the subjects of the Macmillan Committee was why was the financial sector and technology and industry in the US, why do they work so much better than it does in Europe? And so these are questions Europe's been asking for more than a century. At some point in time, every culture just kind of runs out of momentum. And so is that something that's happened in Europe, right? Where um so if you're saying like, okay, now Europe going to suddenly start doing things that it hasn't been able to do for a century, I don't know if that's going to be possible the way things are currently structured.
Especially, it would have to be bottom up because we cannot depend on up like top down with
No, and
the
again,
commission in
that's the
itself.
thing is like if you look at, I mean, there are massive European success stories in the US, for example. And there's a lot of, I mean, you have a huge number of NASDAQ listed companies that had European founders. It's not to say that Europeans are the problem. It's not. I'm incredibly bullish on European founders. It's more of Europe that's the problem.
And can you expand on why you are bullish specifically on European founders and why you are a champion for European tech?
One, I think you have to be. I think if you're living here, you have to have this kind of default position that you want better for the people around you, right? And I think I firmly am a big believer in Western cultural and civilization. And I think in order for the West to keep thriving, you have to have a strong Europe to go with a strong US. And I think,
It's true.
unfortunately, I mean, look, Europe's only produced two companies in the last 50 years with market caps above 100 billion. That's not a strong position in the market. And to me, I'm worried because I hear a lot of like European VCs will just be like, oh my God, this is Europe's time to shine. It's like, yeah, but okay, if it wasn't Europe's time to shine 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when Europe had a much stronger position in the global geopolitical landscape, it was stronger economically, it was a much larger portion of the global publicly listed market cap. If they couldn't do it then, why can they do it now? And I think that's the question I think most Europeans just can't answer.
Legendary brands and legendary companies was 80 to 100 years ago.
Even more. I mean, I think like, look at the average age of a publicly listed company in Germany or France. It's over 100 years, right? So you're talking about most of the champions in Europe have their roots in like 18th, 19th centuries. So at some point in time, it's, I mean, I'm a deep tech investor, right? So one of the points that European VCs always bring up in deep tech is like, oh my God, like Europe has more scientists and engineers, except that doesn't matter. Like the number, IP and science are not these infinitely commerciable elements that you can bring out and bring to the table, right? So you have a finite amount of IP and research that will ever turn into a viable business. So it's not about the quantity, it's about how much can you actually commercialize.
How do you then use this setup for if you're building a company, if you're building a deep tech company out of Europe? What, of course, each company it's a company, right? But then
Well, you take advantage of the arbitrage, right? I think Europe does have good talent in the sciences and in research, and it does have good technical abilities. So you keep your scientists and your researchers in Europe, where the talent is as good, and it's usually at least 30% cheaper, and you can also get subsidies for them. But you put your front office in the U.S., which is, by the way, that's the Israeli model. That's been incredibly successful. I think a lot of European governments are just scared of it, despite the fact that there is overwhelming evidence that that's the model that works.
Why do you think they're scared of it?
Because they still think in these kind of 19th century ways of like, if this company is French or German or whatever, then it needs to be like located here and headquartered here, and the CEO has to be a good Frenchman or German or whatever. And that's just not the way technology works in the 21st century.
And how do you see the collaboration? Because you invest across Europe, how do you see the collaboration in between like European countries and ecosystem?
I think the problem is one of the fundamental issues with Europe is that the governments of nations in Europe, particularly the bigger ones, still put their own national interests before European interests. So there is, within Europe, you have, even within the EU, right, there is essentially an intra-European tariff. The Draghi report has discussed that. The IMF has discussed that, where even just trading amongst European countries, there is a tariff. I mean, there is you basically pay for it prevents like 40% of trade or something like that. And the fact that you don't have standardized legal platforms, legal structures, and things like that, it's just there isn't much collaboration, right? I mean, I remember I was with a bunch of German politicians the night that the Draghi report came out, and they all were just like, whatever. Like, for them, it just wasn't important. And I think that's fundamentally I think there's still a lot of delusions of grandeur in some of these old European capitals, and it's going to be a while for them to brush those off.
And if we take this, the hook from the Draghi report, and you were bestowed the position of CTO of Europe, how would you fix
I think first
innovation?
First and foremost, like they have to unify the capital markets. Like Europe will not have a vibrant ecosystem unless the capital markets are unified. Because that's the thing is, like, as much as going back to this kind of thing with deep tech, where all the European VCs are just like, oh, we produce so many scientists and researchers, etc. The problem is like, again, to create commercially viable companies from IP, you have to be able to direct massive amounts of capital into those sectors. And the way Europe is structured right now, it cannot do that. It can't just say, cool, let's go spend, trillions on X, Y, or Z. It can't. The U.S. capital markets can do that. Europeans can't. And I think fundamentally at the end of the day, it's always going to mean that Europe is going to be in a follower position and not in a leader position. And so first of all, until you fix the capital markets, everything else is just irrelevant.
That's the step one.
Yeah, because it's you've got essentially the U.S. capital markets are like this massive fire hose that you can just direct at whatever is needed, and can just pump trillions into any sector. And some people be like, "Oh my God, it's a bubble," but like honestly, bubbles are good, right? Like if you're trying to plant a field from nothing, you always have to oversaturate. And that's what you have to do in technology as well. So I think the big difference now between sort of the AI quote unquote bubble with the .com bubble is the .com bubble was, I think, in my opinion, far more speculative. I mean, people were laying cable and stuff, and they didn't even know how the businesses were going to work. When AI, there's actual demand. There's an actual global compute industry and internet industry, which didn't exist 30 years ago, where there's use cases for AI where, I mean, I still remember in the 90s, most people were just like, the internet's just a fad. I don't think anybody's arguing that AI is just a fad.
And you've been, besides directly investing, you've been an LP.
Yes, I'm on the board of 2 LPs, which is really interesting. So the vast majority of the stuff I do is direct investing, but I sit on the ICs of 2 LPs, one small one and one very large one.
And how do you see the performance differences between European funds and US funds?
DPI is the main difference. So there's DPI in the US. There's basically TVPI in Europe. I think that's the biggest fundamental difference. And again, going back to the capital markets, right? Like, there's just, you would be crazy to IPO a company in Europe.
Yeah.
Like, it just would not be appropriate for the overwhelming number of cases.
And without a DPI solution, how do you see the industry evolving from now on?
I think in Europe, and there's going to be, so as much as the kind of EU and the European Commission and these governments talk about a need for European growth investment, until you actually have a steady stream of sizable exits in European tech, there's really not an appetite. I mean, if there was this I believe fundamentally in the value of private markets, and that government shouldn't do the job of private markets. And so if there was this overwhelming appetite for growth capital to fund big European companies, the private markets would be there in a heartbeat. But it's not, because there's no exits. You can't have an asset class without exits.
And if we get a little bit more specific to France's position in the global VC landscape, how do you see France evolving at this point in time?
But I think it's like, and again, that goes back to the point. I having these individual conversations on France versus Germany versus, it's all the same shit. I think
it's all the same.
It's all the same
problem.
It's all the same problems, right? There's like no, the Paris, the Paris Stock Exchange has the same problems that the Frankfurt Stock Exchange has, and I think, for historical reasons, I get why French people always want to have kind of the French angle on things, and Germans want to have the German angle, and et cetera, versus all these countries in Europe. But like, Europe has to just start thinking of itself as one entity.
Just like you have the 50 states, but they're working together under one nation.
You get those kind of weird things, right? Where you'll have like the European Space Agency or all these kind of, pan-European entities, which will be like, oh my God, well, we have to make sure we invest in every single European country. You never get like, there's no agency doing that in like U.S. venture capital. Nobody's ever saying, oh my God, we have to invest in Alabama this year or else we're screwed.
Yeah.
Like, it's just not how it works, right? And so I think one of the big issues in Europe, and one of its biggest issues, is obviously the fact that it's hyper fragmented. Right. And so it gets worse because, like, for France, they'll be like, oh, well, there's, if solving for Paris, but what about Bordeaux and Lille and all these places? But like, Europe is already hyper fragmented. When you start fragmenting down to a national level, it's just, you're spreading resources way too thin. Like in Germany, there's like over 80 Max Planck institutes. I mean, geographically, Germany's the size of New Mexico.
Is it really?
Yeah, you don't need
that. Wow.
You don't need all. I get, for historical reasons, like there was reasons why Europe spread things out, but I think now everything's just spread out way too thinly. You do need, there is huge importance, particularly in deep tech sectors, of having sort of centers of critical mass. And so when Europe spreads all these resources out too thinly, I think it's counterproductive.
Besides the supporting where you are, what are the reasons that you keep being excited as well in investing into European companies, and how do you see them like finding the exit path?
The exit path, I think you have to have the companies going pretty quickly to the US. I think you have to have some sort of presence there. Because in B2B, and most deep tech obviously is B2B, there's an old joke that, in Europe, it takes twice as long to raise half as much money. And I think there's a huge amount of truth to that. So, also, one of the things that a lot of the scientists, particularly in Europe, never understand about deep tech is it's not the best science or technology that wins. It's the ones who get the contracts first. Because you get the money first, and you go out and buy the best science and research. And so that's why governments need to be, and one of the things that European governments have been really bad about is governments need to be a customer of first resort for these really forward-thinking technologies. And I see that's consistently happens in the US, and it's consistently happening now with things like quantum and AI. It just still doesn't happen in Europe.
Why the choice on deep tech when because I mean, as an industry, we're really over indexed into enterprise software and SaaS.
Yeah, but I think, again, like most of venture capital over the last 20 years is not venture capital. It's essentially just small cap private equity, right? It got into a very commoditized technology of software and SaaS, right? And the thing, but before the last 20 years, all VC was deep tech, right? Like Google at the time was deep tech. I mean, there was a spin off from Stanford. It was incredibly revolutionary. And then you got the internet just kind of became this big kind of all encompassing thing. And you got really kind of low risk bets you could take. And it was most VC firms, just became small cap PE firms. And so I think again, going back to deep tech, which is really just tech. I hate the term deep tech. It's just it doesn't mean anything. It's actually interesting. I think a lot of people don't know, but the actual term deep tech started at Raytheon.
Oh, really?
It was their skunk works. And it was just something they called all the crazy shit that they were working on. But now it's just become this weird, meaningless blob of a word that just anything
this
is
new sector.
Anything is
really
not
new.
SaaS is deep tech. It's like no, but sure, whatever. But yeah, so I think now VCs are kind of getting back to their roots, but that's also one of my concerns with Europe is a lot of these VC firms that have just spent their entire existence investing in like e-commerce and SaaS are all of a sudden now like, oh, we're investing in quantum. It's like, guys, no, get the fuck out of here. Like you're not quantum investors. You're not photonics investors. You're none of these things. But again, you have, especially in Europe, you have this like Pavlovian response to like what the government LPs want, because so much of the money in Europe comes from the EIFs, the BPIs, the KFWs, etc. If all of a sudden they're like, hey, we want you guys to invest in like defense tech, then all of a sudden all these guys who've been investing in like platforms to buy shoes online are all of a sudden experts in defense or photonics or batteries. It's like, guys, I'm like, come on, you can't, like this, it's not what you do. And so you get a lot of people who've just never been successful as investors, just anytime like the government LP rings a bell, all of a sudden they're experts in something new, which is not a really healthy way to go out building a firm.
You go ahead. No, it's good.
He raises the point on there's no DPI or there's restricted DPI.
I mean, think about it. There was like a Sifted article a while back, and it was just like Europe is leading the US in 1 year TVPI. I was like, who the fuck cares? It's like to think about TVPI for 1 year in an incredibly illiquid asset class makes no goddamn sense. So you get like, and again, it's just like, to me, that just screamed like Europe's inferiority complex. Yeah. Like if you're really stretching for stuff to be winning at in VC, like 1 year TVPI, it just doesn't look like it's a very confident ecosystem.
If we replace deep tech, just in tech in general, into the tech capital stack in Europe, where do you think is the biggest gap? And besides the public markets, so if you would walk down,
I mean, I think that in Europe there's these gaps all along the way, right? There are, if you're looking at, term sheets from universities are usually quite poor in Europe. I mean, I still see universities and spinouts trying to take 20, 30, 40%. Like I just saw one in France where they were trying to take 41%. I was like, what the hell is that? You get that. There's not enough angel investors who've been successful financially in tech. So you have kind of still a gap missing there. You've got scale-up investors who just play conservative. I think a lot of it also goes back to, again, having these government LPs who are just like, cool, you can invest this money, but you can only invest it in one country. Like being successful in VC is hard enough. When then you start having arbitrary geographical restrictions on it, like, again, I think most of the VC firms in Europe then become economic development agents and not actual investors. And that's not their job. I do think Europe has to embrace the powers of private markets. Like what government is necessary, but government should do the job of government and not the job of the private sector.
Yeah. And then which sectors are you excited into where you can, even American firms can come, like where TAM is deep enough in Europe to build massive companies in?
I mean, start looking at like, industries. Europe is still has a very robust pharmaceutical industry, right? Some of the biggest pharma companies in the world are based in Europe. I mean, hell, a little town like Basel, Switzerland has 2 of the 10 largest pharma companies in the world, right? And I think, so there's a lot to be done in where does AI and quantum and all these things converge with pharma and life sciences and medtech? And then, so there's that. So I definitely think that the medtech, biotech, pharma part in Europe still has a lot to be done. Plus, also look at demographics, right? Europe is already the oldest by average age continent on the planet, right? And medical costs are just going to keep going up. So there's a lot to be done on the pharma side. And I think also robotics. You look at some of the top robotics programs in the world, they're in Europe, right? You've got ETH, you've got the one up in Denmark, you've got like different universities that are just producing really good IP in the space. And there are, heavy industrial players in Europe that kind of play this. I think what's sad is the two biggest robotics companies in Europe are now going to be Asian owned. So, was it ABB just sold?
Yeah.
Is selling their thing to SoftBank, and the one up in
KUKA
in
sold to
Germany
China.
is sold in China, right? So Europe's also committing a lot of own goals in very bizarre
Right.
fashions. But I do think there's a lot to be done in, biotech, pharma, and then in I would say robotics and automation, simply because also the two of the kind of things that are crossing over there is the fact that Europe has, really low birth rates, demographic issues, an aging population. If they want to have an economy that keeps going, they're going to have to automate and just go hard into automation and robotics. And if they don't, the European economy is just really screwed. So it's just at some point in time, you can just look at like, what's the necessity?
Yeah.
And then you have to look at kind of industries where you can kind of sit on top of like Spotify being kind of one of the big European tech success stories just exists partly because it wasn't national specific, right? Most of the music if you listen to music in France or Germany or Sweden or whatever, 80% of it's the same. It's not really specialized. So whether it's Skype, whether it's Spotify, it was not these country specific businesses. Where I still see a lot of European businesses set up and they're really focused on their home market, even if there's absolutely no reason to be. And I think that's not smart.
So having more of a global audience, global perspective clientele is the key. One of the keys to
should be global from day one. There's just no way. You're not going to be able to build a unicorn focused on one market in Europe. It's just not possible. And the other problem with Europe is because there's no or very little unifying factor in these markets. Like going from France to Germany is a pain in the ass. So you might as well just go to a bigger market where you can actually be having more upside potential.
Definitely something for entrepreneurs listening to keep in mind. I feel like there's been this trend that I keep reading about more and more U.S. firms opening up offices here in Europe, focusing on pre-seed Series A. How do European VCs remain competitive? Should we be going out to the U.S.? How do we make sure we're, being on these rounds?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's happened before, right? I mean, before your time, but there was a time when, I mean, think about Balderton was originally Benchmark's London office. Excel Europe started up because Excel expanded into Europe. There was Atlas at one point in time. So it was a Boston VC firm. They had 3 offices in Europe. So you've had kind of previous ways, and they always usually end up retreating. It'll be interesting to see if that happens again. Like 816Z already closed their London office.
Yeah, pretty quickly.
So we'll see how that holds up. I think European VCs should embrace it, right? Because the US guys are just raising the bar. And so Europeans, it's going to be great for European entrepreneurs. And so if you as a European VC can't match what the US guys are doing, then you should probably just get a different job. And that's the thing is, like, I think the fact that it is a globalized industry now, like you have to either be as good as the best but it's great. It's Darwinism. And so I think going back to the fact that, you do have a lot of VCs in Europe who are de facto subsidized by government. So there's a lot of VCs in Europe that should just have died out a long time ago. But they don't because they're considered strategically important by their government, so they keep getting money. Like there's a climate tech investor that I know in Europe that gets 75% of its money from its national LP, but it's never had a fund that was in the money.
Interesting.
And it's been around for a long time. So again, like at some point in time, European venture capital has to become an asset class that stands on its own and not like this subsidized economic development tool.
Yeah, we should look at it more as like a means of motivation rather than as a threat.
It's fantastic. Honestly, it's like, but if you're really good and if you really love what you do, you always will want to step up your game.
Yeah.
So if you see the ones who are just like bitching about it, like I would hope they die.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be good for the ecosystem.
As a young for the young investment professionals and for the GPs? Can you build something globally relevant out of Europe in the VC market?
Yeah, I mean, Index is the classic example of that, right? This is a firm that had North American founders, but they started in Switzerland, and Index has built a global. They are the gold standard in terms of European tech VC. So 100% they can. A French example like Sophie Nova. They've been around since the 1970s. They received a large amount of money from Apollo, the big U.S. private equity firm, but Sophie Nova's built themselves a fantastic brand in like medtech, biotech investing. So it's 100% possible to do that. So I don't know. So a lot of European VCs a lot of them just don't have relevant experience. So they always try to think that the problem is like, oh, there's not enough money in the ecosystem. I've never seen a problem in venture capital be solved by more money. It's usually that's not the problem. Like there's other issues, right? There's the fact that, I mean, if you can't make money here, then you should go to a market where you can make money.
Yeah.
And if your portfolio companies are having problems in your home market, then you need to figure out a way for them to solve that.
So you're saying that European VC is a spoiled kid getting subsidized by its rich parents?
Yes. I would say no. I think there's
the late bloomer.
I think
still
no. So I
figuring out
remember
how to make money.
I remember talking to a French entrepreneur when I first came over, and he told me, he's like, look, there's no such thing as VCs here. I was like, oh, okay. He's like, there's VFs. I was like, a VF? He's like, yeah, venture fonctionnaire, which English translation would be venture bureaucrat. He's like, they all get like basically money from the state. They're all just living off of management fees. They don't actually have any exits. So you've got guys who just, in the US, like by the time you're in like your late 50s, you're like, cool, this is my last fund. Where a lot of the venture firms in Europe, like these guys just don't retire because they never had big exits. They don't have fuck you money. Like they can't go on a yacht because they can't afford a yacht. And so it really is problematic for the ecosystem here. Because you got a lot of guys who should have retired a long time ago, but they can't. Because, and again, for them, like the longer they stay in their firm, they can just keep taking all that management fee money.
And how do you think about the 2 and 20 model? Do you think it's going to survive?
But the interesting thing is like the 2 and 20 model. I mean, that's, if you actually look at so at the, what's it called? The Rock Institute. So it's the Institute for Entrepreneurship at Harvard. They have a copy of the initial agreement between, I think it was between the Harvard's endowment and one of the first VC firms. It was actually started by a French guy, Georges Doriot, who ended up being a U.S. citizen. He became a general in the U.S. Army. Anybody who wants to study the history of venture capital should read up on Georges Doriot. But the whole thing is like the LP agreement from 1946 pretty much looks exactly like it does now. So what's fascinating is an asset class which is supposedly all about funding innovation is not innovative itself. The 2 and 20 thing doesn't really make sense. It's just, they happened 2 and 20 back in the 1940s and they were just like, cool, and let's stick with it. And LPs are lazy. So they're okay with 2 and 20. They don't really want to change it. But you're starting to see 3 and 30. You do see variations of it. But I think the bigger issue is going to be lifespan of funds. Like a 10+1+1 fund in deep tech doesn't make any sense. And you've seen like life science funds go to 20 plus year fund cycles. You've seen them go to like evergreen fund structures. Even some of the older US VC firms had evergreen structures. And I think there is room to kind of innovate on that platform. The problem is like LPs just hate change. So, and most of the problems in VC stem from the LPs.
So you need someone like a hot platform like Thrive or Benchmark to kind of come up with something
Thrive.
new.
I mean, Thrive, and again, like and what's interesting is all the big players in the US, they're becoming essentially just asset managers. And venture capital is like one product that they offer. So if you look at Thrive, if you look at like Andreessen Horowitz and these guys, I don't think venture capital is just one thing that they do. And they understood that they have to become like these AUM, accumulating media machines.
You mentioned the word branding earlier. How important is branding to a VC firm? Is it a make it or break it? What's your thoughts on that?
I think today, like if you're not coming from a background where you started a unicorn that's listed for tens of billions, I think you have to have just an incredible media brand today in venture capital. It's just, I think it's because of, there's different, because it's about access to the best deals, but it's also about LPs, right? Like LPs have to know you. At the end of the game, so my first gig in venture capital was with Morgenthaler. So David Morgenthaler, the founder, was the guy who started the National Venture Capital Association. He was the second check into Apple, just legendary VC. But one of his first advice to me is like, look, if you want to last long in this industry, always make sure that you make money for the people who have the money, and make sure that you have just really good relationships with the LPs. And like, if you do that, you can last in this as long as you ever did. And he worked until he was like 90. And so I think, yeah, as a brand, you have to have access to the family offices, the asset managers, and people who just typically wouldn't come to you just if you're a VC based in Paris or Berlin or whatever. And you have to have, because especially now, like the LPs, if you're a European VC and you don't want to go the government route, the three places that really still have money, it's like the US, the Gulf states, and Southeast Asia. And so how, as a European VC, are you going to actually build up a brand that's going to access that? And that's, I think, a key question that a lot of people need to ask, because there's a lot of money in this world. And so it's like, how are you going to build yourself up to put yourself in a position to be able to get those meetings and have the recognition where those people are comfortable, like meeting you and saying, cool, like, yes, I trust this person to make me money.
Going back to your previous experiences, who was who are the most legendary people you worked with, or the best people you worked with?
So I mean, David, he was hugely influential. I mean, he was, he's the guy who back in the 70s got the US to change the laws around allocation for pension funds. For pension funds could invest in venture capital, which changed the industry completely. So you saw a lot of money get pumped into private equity and venture capital in the 80s, partly because of the work that he did in changing those regulations. But even like, I got to like do stuff with Alan Petrikoff, Arthur Rock, like that kind of first generation of VCs. And I got to meet them and have lunches with those guys. I remember meeting, even in France, like I remember meeting and getting to introduce actually to something he spoke at. It was Maurice Chenyov, who was the founder of Apex Partners. Because Apex Partners, it was Ronald Cohen, it was Maurice, and it was Alan Petrikoff were the three guys who started that, because they had met at Harvard. And he told me stories where he was doing deals where he was essentially just like bankrolling. He was essentially providing the debt for Apex to do the deals in France. It was interesting as well, because he told me that when they started, like him and Ron, Sir Ronald Cohen, they were actually doing venture capital deals, because this was like 72, I think they started. And they realized quickly that Europe was just better suited to private equity than venture capital. So they actually changed, by like the 80s, they changed to doing venture capital deals instead of private equity deals.
Oh, wow. And what is it about deep tech that excites you? Why have you chosen this as your specialty as an investor?
I kind of got into it backwards. Like I was, involved in spin-outs from the university, and then just kind of went down that path. And it was never called deep tech before. Like when I started, it was just tech, and then it was, some people might have called it like frontier tech or hard tech or whatever. It was just IP generated businesses, which was the whole, what technology investments had been for the previous decades, right? And for me, it's just about it's the most futuristic stuff. Like investing in another B2B SaaS platform, which is highly commoditized, that's just boring as fuck. It's much more, for me, if it's hardware, if it's anything really interesting in the medical device space, anything that can really build the future, I think that's the most interesting thing you can do. And it's also actual risk. Right. I think a lot of VCs actually shouldn't be VCs. I think most of them are just not comfortable with risk. And like, can you actually foresee what the market's going to be like in 10 years? Like, you can't pretend, but it's just like, cool. Like, I can back the people who, if they're successful, yes, the world is going to be a much more interesting and better place.
How do you go about assessing founders, the technology, and the market? What do you still value founders first?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit different, because in a lot of the really hard, heavy IP stuff, it can get complicated because some of the stuff comes out of labs, and some of these guys are just much more happy being scientists than founders, right? And so that's, you also have to take that by case scenario. So it's not like the internet stuff where it's just like, I think in the internet businesses, the founder should always stay as CEO. I think there's just proven that's the more successful model. Where the really hardcore IP stuff, some of these guys are better suited to just being in a lab. That being said, some of them, I think, look, it's much easier to go from being like a PhD in quantum physics to business than the other way around. So I think a lot of them do have the capacity to be very successful as founders. Some of them, they've spent their whole life studying science and that's what they love and that's what they want to do. So maybe they're better off as a chief science officer or whatever. And evaluating it, you have to bring in IP experts because you're dealing with like real deep tech. You're talking about people who've spent their entire life submersed in a field of science and study. There's just no way that any individual VC is going to be able to address that, right? So you have to look at kind of the business stuff, the stuff that you're good at as a VC, so you can address the market, the customers, kind of see what would be a path to making this an actual viable product, all that kind of stuff. To verify the science, you got to bring in experts. I mean, and also trust, build really good networks with labs and universities and make sure that you have the right people you can call up and be like, hey. And also once you have these good relations with the universities, they'll just bring you quality stuff. Also, a lot of universities are sitting on IP that they don't know what to do with. Like, I mean, I remember meeting with a woman who at the time was head of MIT, and she's like, look, less than 1% of the IP we create will ever be commercialized. So you're also just, even if universities could go from like 1% to 2%, you're talking about globally trillions of dollars of opportunity.
They're sitting on a gold mine,
right? And so you get these questions like, how do you access that? How do you get that? I do think in deep tech, the classic VC model, kind of going back to one of your previous questions, probably isn't appropriate a lot of the time. Maybe it would be much better as a you're looking at what some of the funds do in like life sciences, where they just do pure company creation. So they get the IP, like Flagship Pioneering gets the IP from a Harvard or MIT, and they build a company around that, and that company starts with already a significant amount of money on their balance sheet. And that often would be a better model than traditional venture capital, because especially in some of these industries, it might take 10 to 20 years to make a viable company. If you can accelerate that process by even 2 years, that's a huge financial advantage. And so, like, our holding companies a better way to go about it. Our evergreen funds a better way to go about it. Our company builders a better way to go about it. I mean, there's lots of room for debate about that, but I don't know if a 10 plus 1 plus 1 fund, I have high doubts that that's the best way. I just haven't seen a lot of evidence to show that that's the right way to go about it.
And maybe as we're heading towards then, like some shouts of like some really cool entrepreneurs in Europe that you feel the people should hear about and be aware about.
There's so many. I think you go to any university, right? I think you find a lot of people who are just like, holy shit, like, I wish, this is going to sound really bad. There's a lot of people I'm just like, God, I wish that person would move to the US, because holy shit, they would just be getting so much more money and a lot more opportunities. And I even have companies that, so I invest. So last year, my check size, because I invest on behalf of large family offices and financial institutions. So my check size last year ranged between, so smallest check was 250K euro, largest check was 300 million USD. And so, and I also just see the appetite of what even European private investors have, and they are still more comfortable writing bigger checks to US investments. I 300 million was into a US company by European investors. I don't think I could have gotten those European investors to put 300 million into a European company. But going back, like, there's just a lot of like really good entrepreneurs in Europe who are building really fantastic stuff. And I honestly, I want to give a shot. Like, I think the people coming out of ETH are doing a great job. I think the staff at ETH is doing a great job in Zurich. I think TUM building a great ecosystem in Munich. I think you've got that triangle in the UK of Oxford, Cambridge with Imperial and UCL in London. I think that's a really attractive pipeline of talent. I think you got the technical universities up in the Netherlands. I was on the IC for the Dutch government's quantum fund. The stuff coming out of Delft, super interesting. And And you do see these kind of pockets. I think the key is like, sadly, I think most of those pockets are still not collaborative. I think that's another big step that has to be overcome. And I think, I think that access between, like in continental Europe, and that access between Zurich and Munich, I think is just high quality stuff. The question is going to be like, do they get this kind of mindset to open that up and really get a lot of international investors? Can those companies from there really kind of push being more internationally focused? I think that's the next step in their evolution. But in terms of like the hardware stuff coming from that, I think if I was Europe, I'd put a lot of emphasis in that corridor between Munich and Zurich, because those TUM and ETH are just, and EPFL in Lausanne and other places, they're doing really good jobs.
One question that we ask every guest on this podcast is, what is one piece of advice you would give to, I guess in this situation, let's say an investor who is going to venture abroad, that's going to leave their home country and start in a new country? What's your one piece of advice you'd give to them?
Just do it. I don't sound like a Nike cliche, but just no, because I get that a lot. Where
it's crazy that they're sitting on that one.
Yeah, you're
truly.
I think fundamentally, like, there's just no reason not to. I still think if you're in your 20s and you're an ambitious European, you should go to the Bay Area, even if for a year, 2 years, whatever. There's just no other place that you'll meet that high of a concentration of talent in a very finite space, right? I mean, I remember getting stuck in an elevator in Salesforce Tower next to a guy who IPO'd his company for like 10 billion. There's just like, you're never going to find, I mean, you can be at a dinner and meet more high quality VCs or entrepreneurs. It would take you a decade to meet that in the ecosystem in a European city. So I think if you're young and ambitious, go. There's ups and downs, just like there everything else. The quality of life in San Francisco, I personally don't think is very good, but you're in your fucking 20s. Like, you shouldn't care about that. Like, you just go, you network your ass off. You're going to accelerate your path to being a really good entrepreneur or potential future investor that you just wouldn't be able to do that in Europe. It's just not. It'd be like taking all the ecosystems in Europe and putting them together into one place. And there's just no other ecosystem where you can get that experience.
It's a special area.
But it's also just, I mean, you, again, kind of like going back to the point you were making earlier, like, what should the European VCs do with these US VCs coming over? Like, you should always try to go up, and if you want to be really good at something, you have to compare yourself against the best.
Right.
And if you're going to do that as a young, ambitious entrepreneur or whatever, you need to be able to go to the ecosystem that has consistently produced the best outcomes. And that has been, is, and probably will be for the foreseeable future, the Bay Area.
I want to get to our little round of quick rapid fire questions. So before I pressed record, we were talking about music. I know you're a big music lover. I also know that you are a bass player. You're in a blues band. Tell me about that. How long have you been playing the bass? Why blues?
So I started as a kid playing trumpet in orchestra.
That's awesome.
And was involved in like the local symphony, the youth symphony. And so my maternal grandmother was a piano teacher. I did not take piano, much to her chagrin. She always thought the trumpet was like this noisy, awful thing. She's like, piano's pretty. I was like, okay, whatever. I just want to like make noise, apparently. But that became too much like homework. So when I was a teenager, I just kind of switched over to guitar and then got to guitar and bass. So I've played guitar at a bunch of bands in undergrad. I played at CBGB's, which
you did,
which was an iconic place in New York.
That's a big flex.
We played at like goofy fucking art parties in Lower Manhattan, art rock stuff where there'd be like
always blues or rock?
No, anything. Like, it was like, a lot of jazz, awesome. Experimental stuff, some rock, some blues, whatever. It's just now like in COVID, was just starting to play with some guys, and I when you playing guitar, baritone, bass, but bass in this blues group kind of post-COVID. And I remember playing in some like this woman who was like an experimental artist. Like she was just like she invited a few of us down to play a gig, and we had to like have noise canceling headphones on, so we didn't know what anybody else was playing. And she would just say like A or whatever, so you would know like what key it was in. and then it was just noise.
And you just go for it.
You just go for it.
Wow.
Is the term
That's fun.
experimental art the deep tech for
Yeah, I
VC?
think for anything. It's just like
I
we
love
don't
this
know what the fuck
connection.
to call this shit, so let's just call it. Yeah, but there was always stuff like that. Yeah, like getting kind of called in and just sitting in and jamming with stuff, and it's just it's a fun creative outlet. And yeah, I just kind of grew up with it because it's my grandfather was actually, like, before World War II, was a jazz musician, so he was on a bunch of
Wow.
albums. His cousin, for anybody out there who knows, like, Gibson and Guild guitars, so his cousin was George Barnes, who had his own model Gibson named after him, and his
No
own
way.
model Guild named after him.
It's
I had the
incredible.
chance because it was very limited quantities. I had an opportunity to buy one a couple of years ago, but the guy refused to sell.
Oh gosh.
It was the most expensive model of guitar that they ever made at Guild, and I haven't been able to pick one up, and they're impossible to get in Europe.
Wow.
So yeah, I played in a lot
Hopefully one
of
day you can.
bands.
And what's your favorite song to play?
Oh my god, to play there's anything. I honestly like to play for fun. I think anything kind of going on the jazz side becomes the most interesting stuff. And then also Motown. I think if you play electric bass, like pretty much electric bass,
Motown's fun. Yeah.
everything kind of stems from James Jamerson in terms of electric bass, because people forget electric bass is still a very new instrument, right? It was invented in the 1950s, kind of popularized with Leo Fender and the P bass and everything, but like everything kind of modern, all contemporary modern jazz bass that kind of has James Jamerson as the father of it, more or less. And so that Motown sound, just everything. I mean, he influenced everybody from, Paul McCartney to Chris Squire to every electric bassist, just like Jamerson and Bob Bobbitt and all those guys.
That's awesome. What is your favorite corner of France?
Bassin d'Arcachon.
Oh, very nice.
I have a
West
there.
Coast.
No, I do. I like the Atlantic coast more than the Mediterranean coast.
I do too.
I think it's nicer. It's less
Less touristy.
less built up. I just like the vibe better. You go down, have some oysters, drink some white wine,
Yep.
you're good. But I love that whole coast, Ile de Ré, Ile d'Oléron. You go down past Bassin d'Arcachon, so you go to like, Biarritz and Saint-Jean-de-Luz and all that. And I think I just like that vibe so much
I
better.
spent a lot of my childhood in Ile d'Oléron, so I understand completely. The
it's just- it's
oysters,
just-
the
yeah, it's
the
just-
air just smells good.
It's more mellow. It's woodsy at the same
Yes.
time. Like I think it's the for me that Atlantic coast of France is my favorite part of France, and so it's interesting because it's overlooked by a lot of people.
It is.
At the same point in time, in the summer, it's basically just Paris.
It is, but
like,
you
if
have
you-
so many tourists from France, from England, from Germany
Yeah,
that come,
but
and
I just
more
if
and
you're
more
on
Americans.
if you're like in Cap Ferret, right? Like it's essentially just 16e-sur-Mer.
Yeah, it's just all Parisians are there.
Which is at that same point in time, internationally, it's still, I think, fairly overlooked.
Yeah.
But let's keep it like that, then.
What's
Yeah,
that?
Let's
'cause
keep it
there's
like that.
talks to
Yeah,
develop
yeah,
it, and let's.
Because it's just the Mediterranean stuff I don't get into as much.
Yeah, but I don't think it. I don't think the kind of like the Atlantic coast tailors towards the American imagination of tourism.
No,
Yeah, here in France.
it's just a bit more. It's interesting. I think of like the Atlantic coast of France being almost much more kind of like the Martha's Vineyard
Yes,
type of vibe. It's much more of like
absolutely.
a upper
Cape Cod.
Cape Cod,
Yeah.
upper kind of Atlantic U.S. part, where the Med is just much more. It also meets
It's like
Southern
Orange
California.
County.
Yeah.
To me, it's
that's
much more like a
where I
Southern.
grew up.
And
So
it's
I
like
know.
very.
Yeah, it's a little more superficial. I don't know how to
Yeah,
say it.
it's a bit. I don't want to
I
insult
don't want to
anybody
shit
that
on my
lives there.
hometown, but
I'm just like, I mean, it's. I would much rather go, sailing in the Bassin d'Arcachon than,
yeah, so lovely.
get like swarmed by speedboats in, Antibes or something. I don't know.
Wise words haven't been.
Do you have a last one for us, Chris?
What do you miss most about the U.S.?
I'm there all the time. Because I do most of my investments there. Like I literally was just there the last 10 days.
And how often do you travel?
I travel a lot. I mean, I'm in the U.S. every quarter
Oh,
at
wow.
least, and then traveling around Europe. I'm in Zurich and Basel. I'm in Switzerland every month. UK at least a couple times a month.
And without living in the US, can you get high quality deal flow from there still? Or
Yeah, and that's something I've been really conscious about, is like making sure I keep one foot in the US.
Mm-hmm.
I think the gap between the US and Europe is actually growing, despite the fact of what some European
Interesting.
politicians will
Yeah.
say. So I'm making a conscious effort to like actually spend more time there. I think I'll be doing, I think 50-50 at least going forward, because the stuff I can tell you about one company I angel invested in, and then ended up doing a larger round in. So they spin out from Cambridge. They are in a very interesting space in the compute sector, which is very interesting towards national security and all this fun stuff. They got a meeting with the White House in 48 hours. They went back to number 10 Downing Street and said, hey, by the way, the U.S. White House wants to meet with us. We got a meeting in 48 hours. And this was last month. And the UK government came back and said, oh, we'll be able to fit you in like 6 months from now. I don't think Europeans realize in critically important sectors in deep tech, going back to that fun magical word, the gap is growing. I'm just seeing just so much more money. Also, the fact that the U.S. government, whether it's the DoD, the DOE, Homeland Security, whatever, they are very comfortable being customers of first resort.
Mm-hmm.
I do not see that in Europe. I'm on boards of, from various government entities in Europe, and there's just no urgency, like none. I'm on the board of an IC for DASA, which is the UK MOD's startup program, for the UK part of Diana, which is NATO's startup program. And as much as they're like, Europe's in this sort of wartime economy, like, no, bullshit, it's not. There's just not urgency. We can go into the whole side thing on that, but there's just not. There's just not.
But we do have great cheese and wine.
No, the cheese and wine is there. I think it's, and it's not to say. To me, that's my biggest worry with Europe is just I don't know what more has to happen for there to be urgency.
Yeah.
A lot of VCs will be like, oh my God, things have changed, and like Europe has urgency. I'm like, no, it doesn't. Like the UK MOD is now having to figure out a way to cut multiple billions of pounds from their budget. Like there's no urgency. Like, if you look at, all these different government programs, there's just, you look at, Russia attacked attacked Georgia and whatever. Europe built Nord Stream 1. When Russia annexed Crimea, Europe built Nord Stream 2. Since the start of this current conflict, EU countries have spent over €500 billion on Russian resources, whether it's oil and gas, whatever. Guys, there's no fucking urgency. You can say there's urgency. I think we go real off topic here. I think there's a strong motivation in Europe for that conflict to keep going, because it's one of the things that are keeping some European countries out of recession. The war is pretty much, the defense industry is the only thing keeping Germany out of recession right now. And so I would love to see more urgency from Europe. Europe has to understand that there's trade-offs. Like it can't have its cake and eat it too. Like it's going to have to step up and be far more aggressive. I see the US being far more aggressive in its spending on AI. It's building a lot more in terms of compute infrastructure, in quantum, in even crypto. I just don't see it in Europe.
I'm Brazilian. I immigrated into Europe, but I think the thing that Europe still has to realize is that high standards of life is financed by GDP growth.
It's fascinating because I talk to a lot of Europeans who they don't understand the fact that all the things that they want as Europeans has a very high correlation with GDP growth. They'll be like, oh, GDP growth is not the best way to like value a country. It should be about like happiness and like healthcare. I'm like, yeah, but you don't have that without the growth. It just doesn't. And it's just, I think a lot of Europeans are just, they've had a very cushy 50, 60, 70 years. And I think they've just kind of forgotten the fact that like without that, you don't have this high quality of life if you don't create champions. Like I was in Brussels for a meeting, and they were, I was talking to some people from the European Commission. They were just like, oh my God, like, the U.S. didn't invite Europe to the table when it came to Russia. I was like, well, why the fuck would they? Like, if you don't create industry leading companies, if you don't spend on defense, if you don't spend on security, if you don't do things in finance,
You become irrelevant.
right? And if you're not on the, if you're not at the table, you're on the plate. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that Europe has to be reminded of.
And speaking of plate, we've heard that you actually like to cook quite a bit. And
That's a good segue. To round it off. What's the Michael Jackson specialty?
So I actually, so I've taken cooking courses here, like Ferrandi, Le Cordon Bleu, I've done that. But I actually, weirdly, I was in, I think it was Quiberon. I was in Brittany, and they were having, it was like a crepe festival,
Amazing.
and they had a category like pancakes. And we were supposed to go out sailing that day, but it ended up like not happening for some reason. So I was just like, fuck it, I'm going to enter like the pancake competition. And I won like best
No.
Hell
pancake
yeah, that's
at
amazing.
using my grandmother's like recipe from Sweden. So yeah, I think pancakes.
Just
would
like
be-
a
I want to say like something
regular,
like bisque or whatever.
flapjack style or like
No, so like it's
blueberry
basically
or-
like you whip the egg whites and you fold in the whipped egg whites and everything, so it's a nice fluffy pancake. And I won
Very
best
cool.
pancake, so that was my big culinary claim to fame. I won fucking best pancake at some crepe competition.
you lived an interesting life, huh? So
Mhm.
I think it's you have to. I think life is short and you only get one of them, so you might as well
you
just
might as well win
Yeah.
pancake
do interesting
competitions.
stuff. Yeah. It was just we were there and we were like eating the crepes and like they were just like, oh, they were like, and I was with a couple French people and they were just like, oh my god, you're American, you should enter the pancake competition.
Oh my gosh.
And I remember asking, I was like, you guys have a KitchenAid? And they're like, you need a KitchenAid to make pancakes? I was like, yeah, I need to whip
Yeah.
the fucking egg whites. So and they were like, all right.
I love it. Well, Michael, thank you so much for spending time with Chris and I today on Venturing Abroad. I really loved your insights, especially talking about having Europe work together as a continent and less by country, and also leaning into the university labs. I think that's some big takeaways for me from this conversation. So thank you for shining a light on that, and thank you, Chris, as well,
And
for joining us.
I will coin the term experimental tech
Yeah.
as the new tech, deep
Exactly.
tech.
It's like,
Tech
there's
stuff.
all sorts of weird. There's also weird phrases for like white noise jazz and stuff. It's just
Oh
terrible.
gosh, yeah. Well,
But
thank you.
thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.